It's time for another WrestlePlanet news update, as Roman Reigns' next challenger has been revealed. We look at the scrapped plans for the ending of Impact Slammiversary. Tony Khan has been asked about Daniel Bryan signing for AEW. And we have even more news regarding CM Punk and Daniel Bryan's talks with AEW. All that and more coming up in today's video, but first... Throughout history, there has arguably never been a more popular wrestler than Stone Cold Steve Austin. Austin was WWF's top star during their hottest period, the Attitude Era, and when that glass broke, the arena went into a frenzy. He smashed merchandise records, he drew houses, and was a huge mainstream star. Austin's close friend Jim Ross recently named which current AEW roster member reminds him of Stone Cold, revealing that he feels Jon Moxley is the closest thing we've had to the rattlesnake. Jim described the similarities between the two and said, "Jon Moxley is the closest thing I've seen in pro wrestling like Stone Cold since Stone Cold. Attitude, body language, facial expressions, legitimate intensity, absolutely phenomenal." JR went on to discuss AEW and the return of fans, making further comparisons to the Attitude Era, with the fresh crowds reminding him of the glory days. He added, "I'm just in love with our roster. The guys are having so much fun. Our audience, because they're younger, they come prepared. They have their signs, posters. It reminds me of the Attitude Era as far as audience participation." Obviously, with fans locked down for a year and a half, unable to attend any events, let alone wrestling shows, excitement in AEW arenas is back to where they were at the start of the promotion, and with the debut of CM Punk and Bryan Danielson seemingly on the horizon, it looks like the excitement isn't even close to its peak. But what do you think of Jim Ross's comparisons? Let me know in the comments down below. Nick Gage made his AEW debut this week after being revealed as Chris Jericho's next opponent as he tries to get through 4 challenges in order to get a match with MJF. On a recent episode of the Wrestling DeLorean podcast, Gage was asked about recent comments by Don Callis that referred to Kenny Omega as tougher than Nick Gage. Gage was asked if he'd have a match with Kenny, answering that he'd have no problem wrestling him as long as it was in a death match. Gage went on to discuss his thoughts on Omega's most infamous death match, that being the exploding barbed wire death match with Jon Moxley at AEW Revolution this year. Gage didn't seem to be impressed and said, "I don't know what happened there, man. I just feel like they're using Hollywood glass and they are snipping the barbed wire because any barbed wire I've been in or getting hit with, I always get stuck in it. I always start bleeding and any glass I land on, my back starts slicing up, bleeding really bad. So for them not to have no blood on them or blood just on their forehead makes me second guess what they are using, you know what I mean?" He did go on to speak about Kenny Omega as a wrestler, issuing praise for the belt collector by saying, "Kenny Omega is an awesome wrestler, man. Props to that guy. It's so insane. He's got about 16 belts around his waist right now and neck and shoulders. He is a great wrestler, but yeah, I'll take him in a death match. We will surround that ring, put up 200 light tubes and we'll see who the king of the death match is." Now that the door is open to Nick Gage in AEW, he'd be a great addition to the roster as the most violent man in the promotion. Let's hope we see more of him after his match next week with Jericho, and who knows, we could even see Omega show up in Gage's home of GCW after the promotion publicly invited him to their homecoming event after Callis' aforementioned comments. On last night's episode of SmackDown, WWE Universal Champion Roman Reigns accepted a challenge from the recently returned Finn Balor. To open the show, John Cena made a challenge of his own, calling for Reigns to come to the ring to respond. Reigns never showed up, sending Paul Heyman out instead. Later in the night, during the closing segment of the show, Reigns addressed Cena's promo, calling him a nostalgia act, with Cena returning with the same music, same outfit, same entrance, same run to the ring, same promo, and same insults. Reigns compared Cena to the same thing over and over, like missionary position every single night, which was pretty funny. Reigns went on to decline Cena's challenge for the Universal title before being interrupted by Finn Balor, who put his name forward for a match instead. Fans chanted "Roman's scared" before the tribal chief accepted Balor's offer. There is currently no word on when this match will happen, with plans within WWE still set to see John Cena Jr. and Roman Reigns face off at SummerSlam next month. This means the title bout between Balor and Reigns is likely to happen on an episode of SmackDown in the build-up to the summer event. Next up, we have a report from the Wrestling Observer of scrapped plans from the recent Impact Slammiversary event. The ending of the show saw New Japan star Jay White debut to confront Kenny Omega and the Good Brothers, teasing a feud between Bullet Club and the Elite. It turns out that this wasn't the original plan, with Andrade El Idolo in line for the spot before negotiations with Impact fell through. The two parties were unable to come to terms on a financial agreement, which led to Impact turning to Plan B. Going forward, Andrade would have been managed by Conan, joined by two partners who have not been named in the report. In the report, it said that Omega did not know that Jay White was going to be showing up at the event until he turned up in Nashville on the day of the tapings. As we mentioned in our Slammiversary potential surprises video, Andrade was teased by Impact in the lead up to the event. Omega and Andrade are set to clash at Triple Mania for the AAA Mega Championship, and it looks like they were set to feud over the Impact World title too. And quickly, just before we continue, make sure you scroll down and drop a like and subscribe with notifications turned on so you don't miss any upcoming wrestling content as we head towards 20,000 subscribers. But now that you've done that, let's get on with the rest of the video. And next up, we have more news that involves AAA booker Conan, who revealed on his Keeping It 100 podcast that he recently spoke to Tony Khan about the possibility of Bryan Danielson heading to AEW. Conan revealed that he inquired to Khan about Bryan in order to book him for AAA at some point in the future. He said that Khan refused to answer the question, and this is the quote from the podcast, with Conan saying, "I will tell you this because I did ask Tony Khan. The only reason I asked him is because I wanted to use Bryan Danielson in AAA. I was like, hey man, have you signed Bryan Danielson? He goes, you know I can't tell you that. And then I looked at him and I go, bro, if that dude shows up in Chicago, that place is gonna melt. And he just smiled. So I think he might have, but he has not told me." There's been a lot of talk of Bryan having already signed with AEW over the past few days, with the reported planned debut set to happen at AEW Dynamite Grand Slam in the Arthur Ashe Stadium, which will hold AEW's largest crowd to date. I feel that this story from Conan only adds fuel to the fire, because if Khan hadn't been in talks with Bryan, he would have simply denied it. Either way, it's cool to know that AAA are also interested in booking Bryan, meaning we'll see him in Mexico as well as Japan, with Bryan said to be wanting to work in New Japan as well. Now let's go to our final story, as we have another report from the Wrestling Observer, who have provided further updates in regard to CM Punk and Bryan Danielson joining AEW. Whilst they have been unable to confirm either signing, Meltzer did note that Bryan and AEW have been talking for months and has been weighing up his options between New Japan Pro-Wrestling, WWE and AEW. He noted that New Japan is still the X factor that will make up his mind, which is why WWE recently opened up talks with the Japanese promotion over a working relationship. Meltzer believes that if it wasn't for the pandemic, Bryan would have already wrestled in New Japan, and said, "My belief is that if it was not for the pandemic, Danielson would have already been wrestling in New Japan by now, unless a deal was made with WWE or AEW where he promised them the first appearance and match back, since the AEW or WWE money offers would be so much higher, and thus it was a virtual lock he was ending up in one place or the other." Whilst this isn't written too well, I think he's essentially saying that AEW and WWE are able to offer more money, therefore signing with one of those two makes more sense, but only if New Japan dates are also allowed. As we know, AEW already have an agreement with New Japan, which is why they are currently the front runners. If WWE manages to set up a similar relationship, then they might be able to get back in the race. Basically, Bryan Danielson wants to wrestle in New Japan first and foremost, but it's more beneficial to do it through an American promotion who can pay him more as long as he's allowed to jump to Japan. As for CM Punk, Meltzer noted that his sources within WWE believe Punk has in fact already signed with AEW, which mirrors the initial report from Fightful which broke the news in the first place. Meltzer said, "There are a number of things going on behind the scenes that would indicate that, but nobody in AEW has confirmed it, and of course, they won't until the decision is made for them to go public with something of that magnitude." This makes me wonder whether WWE's belief that Punk has signed with AEW comes from the fact that they tried to negotiate with him turning them down due to him already having a contract. Since the Punk reports have been published, secondary ticket sales for All Out in Chicago have increased by 18%, with prices starting at around $141. And before you go, make sure you check out my 10 cancelled AEW plans video where I discuss CM Punk's history with AEW.